Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here to give you some tools, some weaponry to help you consider the thorny and controversial idea of when performers should make large sectional repeats, particularly in instrumental music. And this applies to either orchestral music or chamber music. It doesn't make any difference, particularly from the classical period up until like now. I mean, it depends on the work. I mean, I guess that's the short answer. But let's just consider the notion of a big sectional repeat in a movement. Normally when we bring that up, we're talking about symphonic or large chamber work first movements in what we call sonata form. But there's a long and illustrious history to music before we get to that point. So at its most basic, why repeat anything exactly when you've just done it? There are a couple obvious reasons that may come to mind. Most tunes, let's start with the basics. Most tunes have internal repetition. I mean, if you just listen to a song, you'll often hear verses and refrains alternating back and forth with exactly the same music. Sometimes the words change. Sometimes the refrain has the same words every time you hear it. But there is repetition, and the repetition makes the form larger. It's not obvious, right? It also gives you an opportunity to hear what's theoretically a really marvelous tune, a really catchy thing that your ear will naturally enjoy hearing over and over again. Let's just take a very, very simple tune. How about, there's that wonderful story about, the origins of the British national anthem, God Save the King. Let's think of that tune. King George, he stayed out late, he stayed out very late, he was the king. Queen Lizzie paced the floor, the king came home at 4, she met him at the door, God save the king. Right, now we all know that one, right? That tune has no internal repetition of phrasing, but it has a cadence at the very end. Because imagine what would happen if you stopped in the middle. King George, he stayed out late, he stayed out very late, he was the king. Very unsatisfying, right? And so it continues. Queen Lizzie paced the floor, the king came home at 4, she met him at the door, God save the king. That's the cadence. It brings us back home in a very, very satisfying way, if perhaps it wouldn't have been as satisfying for King George. But that particular tiny little theme doesn't have a lot of internal repetition. Let's consider a different one, though, one that does have the kind of repetition we're talking about. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, or À vous dirai-je, maman, as Mozart used it as his subject for a set of piano variations. It's dum bum ba 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 ba, dum bum 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 ba. I mean, that's a complete unit all by itself. But then it goes on. Da 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 da. You couldn't just stop there. It's in the middle of nowhere. So what do? Bring back the first phrase. Dum bum ba ba da 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 da. Oh, how satisfying that is. And so that kind of theme has two basic halves, as God Save the King does, basically, also. But those two halves are divided in first phrase, dum bum ba ba da 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 dum. It's complete, but you want to move on. And the second half has the what you might call the middle section. The B section, if it's an A, B, A, which is what that theme is. The B section, then the return to A. Now, this particular form, A, pause, B, A, is in two big chunks, one of which is 1/3 the length of the other. But that's called a binary melody in musical parlance because it really has two parts. The part which is the introduction. It tells you what the theme is. Then you've got the middle part, which sort of goes elsewhere harmonically and requires a resolution. And then the A part again, which brings you home. And it brings you home because the initial statement was, harmonically speaking, complete in and of itself, and makes a lovely conclusion as well as a beginning. That kind of idea, this A, comma, BA, is the origin of all of the issues that we have with repeats in later music. Instrumental music began, solo instrumental music, or the idea of what we call the sonata in instrumental music, with that kind of a shape. If you listen to Scarlatti sonatas, for example, they all have that shape, virtually all of them. I mean, there are a couple exceptions. But they start with a section, and that section can be quite a bit longer than Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. It could be several minutes. Then there's a middle section where the music seems to go somewhere else. And then the opening section returns, often recomposed in some way, so as to emphasize that idea of harmonic homecoming. And so what determines the shape is the overall scheme of harmonies. It's the direction of the music and the need we feel, the psychological need when we listen to music, to have a satisfying resolution at the end. And that resolution happens by returning to the home key and making a very strong and emphatic cadence, an ending that says, without any question, we are done. Okay. So that's how the whole repeat business gets started. I mean, now, why do it twice? Why play the first half twice and the second half twice, which is what happens in all these Scarlatti sonatas and most instrumental music that is considered binary? All of the C.P.E. Bach piano sonatas, everything up until the classical period. Why do we do it that way? Well, the obvious reason is, first of all, to make it longer, to, again, like in the song, to let us hear the material more than once, especially if it's really catchy and interesting. The other big reason was to give the performers the opportunity to ornament, to change it on the repeat, to add something of themselves, to give you a straight presentation the first time through, and then to doodle it and jazz it up the second time through, something that most performers were willing to do. Now, in the orchestra, that's a bit of an issue, isn't it? Because you've got like a whole bunch of violins. They're all supposed to be playing the same thing. And you wouldn't expect performers to just go and wing it the second time around. Otherwise, you would have chaos in the orchestra. Woodwind players, on the other hand, or sometimes brass players, whose parts by very nature tend to be soloistic, did and would ornament repeats. Sometimes, rather unfortunately, we have some written testimonial evidence that was going on. So doing something different the second time around is a very, very powerful incentive for composers to permit repeats. And that's where things stood for, well, until about Haydn came along, of course. Everything stands the way it stood until Haydn came along. Because what do you have in a symphony? In a symphony you have, let's talk about orchestral music, because it's a little simpler sometimes than what goes on in chamber works in terms of what you're going to hear. You have a first movement. And the first movement is going to be in that classical binary form, what we now call sonata form. It'll have an exposition, which presents the tunes. It will have a development section, which does things with them. It's that middle da 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 that demands resolution with the restatement of the original material. But in this case, all of it in the home key to emphasize that concept of returning to where we started and to make a satisfying ending. That's what happens in these first movements. And all of them until Haydn's, until the first movement of Haydn's 80th Symphony, I believe, have repeats in both halves. You will almost never hear that in performance. Today you do, with the period instrument folks who insist on playing every repeat. But Normally, until very, very recently, you only heard an exposition repeat, if that, and then the second half played once. Because on recordings, particularly on recordings, you can play it over and over again as much as you want. There's no need to get to know it, and there isn't going to be any kind of free improvisation going on. Now, with the period instrument movement, that has changed. There is a certain, limited degree, sometimes of improvisation, but in any case, there is a mood afoot to respect all repeats and play them all no matter what. The interesting thing in looking at the history of this, though, as far as Haydn went, is that when he did something really special at the end of a movement or somewhere along the way, he would change his attitude with respect to repeats. And Haydn's repeats are almost never perfunctory. He writes knowing that you're going to go back. And so he writes knowing that he has a choice. He can fool you into thinking, are you going forward or are you going back? And you'll hear this if you listen to the Haydn Symphony Crusade talks, where there are certain symphonies where the issue of the repeat is he makes it a moment, something wonderful. Now, Mozart almost never did that. Mozart had this really, really amazing sense of formal symmetry. He tended not to write, for example, long introductions to movements. He almost never wrote codas. They just end at the end. And his repeats are almost perfectly symmetrical. He always indicates them, and whether you fulfill them or not is a really individual choice. I've talked about, for example, how in Mozart's G minor symphony, if you take all the repeats in the slow movement, it becomes as long as the rest of the symphony practically. It's not a very good idea. I think it can make the whole thing very, very dull, and some of those repeats are quite perfunctory. In slow movements, whether you get repeats depends on what the form of the movement is. If it's a binary movement, you may have first half and second half repeats. Although again, Haydn stopped writing those somewhere in the late 1770s, or 1780s, in the symphonies that are in the number 70s that Haydn was working on. Somewhere in the 70s, out of 107, he started writing slow movements that were through composed, if they were in sonata form. And many of his movements are in other forms. They're in variation forms or something else. So the whole scheme of repeats would be quite different. Now, in dance music, minuets and such, you almost always have a standard scheme, which is AA, BB, CC, DD, AB. In other words, you have the basic initial section, which is in two parts, both of which are repeated. Then you have a middle section called the trio, which is in two parts, both of which are repeated. And then you have a return to the A section without the repeats. Sometimes there can be variations. It depends on whether or not the composer writes out the repeats in the A section and varies them himself, which sometimes happens. It depends on whether they tell you what to do. There are many, many minuets in both symphonic, orchestral, and instrumental music that say at the end of the middle section, minuetto da capo senza replica, meaning take it from the top without repeats. And it's an open question whether that custom, which is quite frequently encountered, means that normally you would ignore the repeats, or only ignore the repeats where they tell you to ignore the repeats. Nowadays, again, we tend to be quite literal. And so we may take all of the repeats all of the time. I personally think that you should usually ignore repeats unless there are written out repeats which suggest that you have to take them all. And it depends how long the piece is, right? I mean, one of the shortest of all of Haydn's late minuets is that in his last symphony, the London Symphony, number 104. The opening section is ba-da-dum bum ba-dum bum ba-dum bum ba-da-dum bum ba-da-dum bum 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 ba-dum. That's it. And it's repeated quietly the second time around. So that tells us, because there's a written out repeat the second time around, you can't play it without the repeats when it comes back. And so the second half of it, which is actually a regular repeat, it's not written out, you have to do it because you did it for the first half, so you should do it for the second half. I mean, those are the kinds of bits of reasoning that go into it, and it's all pretty normal. Where things get even more complicated is when you start with like Beethoven, because Beethoven was not a very good repeat guy. And this is just the way he was. I mean, he had a failing. His failing was he often wrote lousy repeats, unnecessary repeats, because they were formally, standard practice. And Beethoven didn't bust every rule immediately, at least. He adhered to the standard practice as often as not. And also, his music has so much forward impetus, so much drive toward going somewhere, that to go back and start over again is just mind-bogglingly annoying. And there are some symphonies where a repeat is a good thing, and some symphonies where it's really just very, very perfunctory and ill-considered. And, let's just go through them. The first two, okay, those are kind of normal because they have a standard form where the exposition comes to a firm conclusion and can go back. It doesn't kill you. But where it does kill you is in the Eroica. Oh my goodness, for years, no one would have ever thought of putting a repeat in the Eroica, because it's so, the music's going do 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 do, about to drift off into the development section, and then all of a sudden you hear bwadum do 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 do, and you're all the way back at the beginning after like 3 or 4 minutes of music that's been going crazy moving forward. It's a horrible repeat. Absolutely horrible. Ironically, the one place where you don't need repeats, which is on recordings, is where they start showing up, because performers started including them to do something that's different, or to make sure that everything that the composer wrote would be on the record, where they would never do it in a live performance. Because the audience would just get bored. It was too much. It made the thing too long. And the Eroica is very, very long, as we know. So that's one controversial case. The Fourth Symphony, all right, it's okay, you can do it. The Fifth Symphony, well, it's a very short first movement with a very short exposition. And so if you don't go back, you could argue that the music is really going to be too short. If you do go back, you can argue, oh, gee, it's so exciting. Why can't it go forward? I would say that's a, on again, off again case. In the Sixth Symphony, it's a good repeat. There's no question about it. It goes da 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 dum ba dum bum bum ba da da dum ba dum bum. Does it go forward or does it go back? It's a question, and it has two answers. That's the Haydn kind of repeat, the kind that he liked to do, where you have options, and depending on which one you take, it's a point of form, an imaginative point of form. So yeah, take the repeat in the Sixth. Don't have to, but if you do, it's going to sound okay. And also the music is so mellifluous and beautiful, and it's not aggressively moving forward. It's more relaxed, so it's all right. The Seventh, on the other hand, oh my God, the Seventh has a horrible repeat. You should never take the first movement repeat in the first movement of the Seventh Symphony. Why? Well, it goes ba-dum, 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 bum. Then if you're going to go back, the problem with that is not where you end, it's where you're going back to. Because the beginning of the exposition is that bum bum ba-dum 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 ya da-dum ba ba-dum yum bum bum ba-dum ba-da. Now, I could see a repeat in the first movement of the Seventh Symphony if you went back to something loud. Ba-dum 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 bum. That would be a much better place, but that's not what Beethoven wrote. If we could have sort of been there and slapped him around a little and say, no, don't go back to that, go back to this, then I think it would be far less controversial. Now, the Eighth works perfectly well because it's jum pa 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 bum pa 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 bum pa 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 bum da 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 da, and you're back to the beginning. Works beautifully. And then in the Ninth, Beethoven eliminated the first movement repeat entirely. He said to hell with it, finally, and just moved on with what they call a counterstatement, meaning a written out repeat of the opening theme, or any theme for that matter, but principally the opening theme in a sonata movement. And that move by Beethoven caused so much of the trouble with respect to repeats that we hear later, because after that, composers had to decide, are they going to put in a big repeat at the beginning of their movement or not? Second half repeats had gone. They were gone by Haydn's London symphonies. They really were. The last major symphony by Haydn was the first one he wrote for London that had a second half repeat in its first movement, and that was number 96. The slow movements, like I said, had lost their repeats in Haydn from the symphonies in the 70s, actually as far back as number 67, because it has a treat at the end that would not bear repetition. I'm not going to give it away, tell you what it is. And so that was not a problem as far as slow movements went. And with the rest, the scherzos or minuets, the dance movements, they stayed the same. And then in the finale, it depended on what the form of the finale was. If it was a sonata form movement, yeah, you could have second half repeats. It could be a variation movement where you would have a whole different scheme of repeats within the various variations, or it could be a rondo. And in those cases, normally you would only repeat the opening rondo theme, and then the whole movement goes the way it goes, with different episodes and the theme coming back, normally without its repeats. Those are all the options. So that's where Beethoven left it. Now, after that, what you get really depends on the composer. And, Schumann, for example, has no repeat in the first movement of his Rhenish Symphony. And thank God. The Rhenish Symphony begins with this wonderful driving tune, and you would never there's no place for him to go back. Unfortunately, he's not always sure how to go forward, and it kind of gets stuck in the middle. But the concept is there. Mendelssohn is a very, very interesting case. His most popular symphony is the Italian Symphony, and for generations, no one even knew there was a repeat in the first movement, not in the second halves. The second halves are long gone. Long gone. After Haydn, they're gone. Forget second halves, but first half exposition repeats. Mendelssohn has one in the first movement of the Italian Symphony, and it's a beautiful one. And it's a pity to lose it. And what makes it a pity to lose it? Well, it's not just that you're going to hear the music again. It's the fact that if the composer writes a long lead back, there's a big chunk of music that you only hear once if you do the repeat. It's probably sensible to do the repeat. It's also the case with Schubert in his famous last sonata, the B-flat sonata, Deutsch 960. That has a lengthy passage that has additional material that you're only going to hear if you go back. If not, you stop at the end and you skip over to the development section. And it's a pity to lose that music. It's beautiful music. And sometimes it adds something really significant to our understanding of the music. In the case of the Schubert, it's the only place where, the music, it chuggles along, da, 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 da. Da, 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 however it goes, And then there's that low trill. Well, it's all this quiet trill. Well, you only hear it loudly once, and that's in the transitional passage that goes back. And it's kind of nice to hear it loudly at one time. It adds something to the character of that ominous object. So those are considerations that you need to think about when you're listening to performances of these works. And again, overall length is an important thing. Now, let's consider some other composers later on. We have Brahms. Now, Brahms did exposition repeats in his first two symphonies, his first three symphonies. The first two are bad repeats. They're absolutely unnecessary, and they're the one in the first symphony is just horrible. It da 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 blomp, and it starts all over again. It's going da 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 ba 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 ba. You know how it goes. do 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 do, and then all of a sudden, thwomp, do 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 do. But you don't want to hear that again. No, we don't. Now, some performances do it. I don't think it's evil when it happens. It depends also on the performance, on the conductor, on how, sometimes they sound more satisfying, sometimes they don't. In Brahms' Second Symphony, no. The music spends so much time waking up from its quiet and calm beginning to become energetic and purposeful and forward moving that I think just to do it all over again, you start all over again. You're like, no, we just got to this point. Why do we have to go back? But on the other hand, in the Brahms Second Sextet, which we've talked about, which just begins with a little oscillation, like this, Brahms spends a tremendous amount of time at the end of the exposition coming back to that opening so that you have a choice. You can go forward or you can go back, and it works either way. It works very, very well. But that's not so much the case in the Second Symphony. Now, the Third Symphony has a good repeat. It has a repeat which makes a lot of sense harmonically and melodically, and it's also very short. It's a compact movement, and so it really is logical to get to hear that music twice. And Brahms sets it up. He sets it up because there is that two-note introduction, bwam, bwam, bwa-dum, bum, ba-da-dum. And so there are many approaches to it. And he can use that as a door that opens this way or it opens that way. And you get your choice. The Fourth Symphony has no exposition repeat at all. He decided to leave it out, and a wise thing it was. Dvorak is another interesting case. His last two symphonies before the New World, 7 and 8, have no repeats. He also had no repeat in his Third Symphony. People tend to forget. That's a beautiful, beautiful work, his first symphonic masterpiece, arguably, and it has no exposition repeat in the first movement. He did have one in his fifth and in his sixth. They are ignored in virtually all performances in Czechoslovakia because Dvorak is on record as having said to eliminate the one in the first movement of the Sixth Symphony. But again, that's a situation where he wrote a beautiful lead back to the quiet opening, and so I think you should do it. I think you should do it because you gain some very, very beautiful music, and it doesn't hurt anything. I think in Dvorak's case, he may, because he omitted the exposition repeats in the next two symphonies, he may have felt he was in exposition repeat omission mode, so he went back and said, no, you don't have to do it. But I think you should. There's no right answer. Depends on the performance and how you feel about it. If it's going to be dull to go back, don't go back. But if you can do it, it's a nice thing. In the New World Symphony, however, which is a really fascinating case, he does write an exposition repeat. And in that case, because he left it out of the previous two symphonies, you should definitely take it. First of all, it's nicely set up. It works perfectly well. Second of all, it's, again, a very short and compact first movement. So it has a big, long introduction. So if you don't take the repeat, then the main body of the movement can seem too short. And then finally, I can end this with Mahler. Mahler is also a very, very interesting case because Mahler had an exposition repeat in the first movement of the First Symphony, which Bruno Walter never observed. Bruno Walter was his associate, and he would have known. So we don't know necessarily whether Mahler observed it either. Was it just a formality, or was it something he intended? But in the Sixth Symphony, he also indicates an exposition repeat. And by then, Mahler had given up writing anything like exposition repeats in his symphonic first movements. And so, or his movements in sonata form, because not all of his first movements are in sonata form at that point. So when it comes to the Sixth, if he writes it, you should take it. It really works best if you do, for the proportions of the whole. But there were other things happening. One of the most interesting cases, aside from those, are the not normal German symphonic composers, the ones who are not so much concerned with the classical tradition and treatment of tonality. For example, Bruckner never wrote exposition repeats in his first movements. His scherzos, his dance movements, are in standard ABA form, no question about it. But his first movements, nope. He just moves along because his expositions have 3 different subjects and they come in chunks, and he knows how to chunkify his music without having to go back. Thank God, everyone would say, because his music doesn't move in a conventional way in any case. So to do this conventional thing would have been totally wrong. And he seems to have understood that from the very start of his symphonic career, which happened when he was in his 40s. So he wasn't like a kid. Tchaikovsky also did not write exposition repeats after his first, his earliest symphonies. He just dropped them, and that works very, very well. So the standard nowadays is to not have repeats, not have big, large structural repeats, unless something very, very unusual is happening. I mean, there are some composers, for example, Janacek, who has repeats all over the place because that's the way his melodic structure goes. And it's simply shorthand. It's not because he's making a big structural point. It's because it's just easier to write them that way because they're identical for. I mean, the second movement of the Sinfonietta, da 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 dum pa da 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 dum pa da 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 dum. I mean, the difference is the last 2 notes of the phrase. So you don't need to write it twice. You just do it once and say, second time, play these 2 notes. You should always take repeats in those cases because that has to do with the symmetry of the individual phrase in the short term. And Janacek does that everywhere. So, he's one of those exceptional composers that whose style you have to understand and simply accept if you're going to handle repeats in an intelligent way. And that, my friends, is sort of observations on what to do with repeats. So what are the considerations? The considerations are, first, do repeats offer an opportunity to change the music? Well, that ended really with the classical period. I mean, it sort of ended with the Baroque period, but it really ended with the classical period. So that's one consideration that performers need to consider when they play that kind of music. 2, is there a second half repeat in addition to a first half repeat, and what do you do about it? 3, does it make the movement too long? Is it a short movement or a long movement? And so what effect will observing a repeat have? That's a big issue. And then finally, what does the composer do? Does the composer write a good repeat that gives us the opportunity to go back and makes it desirable? Or does he not care? Does he just put a repeat sign there and because that was the traditional form, just to make the piece longer, to give people a chance to hear it again? And as Brahms pointed out, once people know what the music is, there's no need to take a repeat because they already know it. They've heard it. They know what the tunes are. They can best just follow it if you move on. So those are sort of your main considerations with respect to repeats. And with that, I turn you loose to make up your own mind when you hear various performances. And as I said, today, you're much more likely to hear repeats. Only through the middle of the 20th century, you wouldn't hear repeats. It was a question of taste. And it comes down to that, too, at the end of the day. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks for joining me. Take care.